There's a real difference between carbon and other pollutants that we've been successful over time. So the question is, what have we learned and what can we learn? And how can we then think about carbon policy and regulating carbon to get moving in time? We are moving now. The Government of Canada has started a regulatory agenda that is pushing forward. How can we basically transfer some of that success?
Okay, I'm going to go back and talk about, before I talk about how we can learn from past success, I'm going to talk about what we've actually done. I would argue that the characteristics of these pollutants has led to a certain type of policy response on behalf of governments.
Right.
There were in specific uses throughout the economy, there was substitutes available, and they were generally reasonably low cost to install these substitutes, reasonably low cost.
Right.
And so government could basically go in and say, when you do this activity, we want you to change it so you do it this way. So in other words, when you sell gasoline, you can no longer have any lead in it. And it was able to do that because it was only looking at a very small subset of activities. And there was a very clear alternative type of activity, in most cases, that could be used, substituted for the original activity, and where it wouldn't be a really big environment or economic impact, but it would produce a substantial environmental gain. Again, government could be very, very prescriptive, develop these detailed, what we call command and control regulations, to tell companies or individuals exactly how they should behave when they did certain activities. And I would argue this is not at all the case for carbon dioxide emissions. Because of the characteristics of carbon dioxide, every activity that we do emits carbon dioxide. There's not an obvious, low-cost, immediate technological substitute. There's no silver bullet. We're talking about, changes that are going to impose some modest costs on the Canadian economy. So it's not a no-brainer to change over to these new technologies. There's actually, you need to make an economic case or an environmental case for changing over to these new technologies. We need to start thinking about changing the types of policy instruments we're going to use to be more designed to control emissions from very different activities, and not necessarily from big point sources like factories, but from non-point sources like vehicle exhaust or agricultural emissions, for example. And in that case, it becomes more difficult to endorse a kind of traditional regulatory response, and particularly when you start thinking about regulating emissions throughout the entire economy. And so there needs to be this real change in the way governments think about applying policy. It's a really difficult change for governments to make, and it's a really difficult change for the public to endorse. In a lot of cases, these new types of policy instruments involve really obvious changes to prices. So, for example, tax policy is something is a policy that I'm talking about here, imposing a tax on carbon emissions. And in that case, it's obviously been something that's been a really controversial type of policy, both in Canada and in other countries, because it exposes consumers and industry to cost increases that may be less visible in the case of traditional regulatory instruments. As we start trying to move aggressively to regulating carbon emissions, we need to not only need to decide to aggressively regulate carbon dioxide emissions, we also need to decide, along with that, we need to make really substantive changes in the way that we've approached environmental policy.